reversing black and white, confusing right and wrong. These are accusations often unfairly pinned on dialectics. In the descriptions above, you might find yourself agreeing with some parts and disagreeing with others. But clearly, under the many hats of prejudice people place upon dialectics, it resembles a calm ex-husband, quietly enduring everything without resistance or justification. To most people unfamiliar with philosophy, dialectics appears to be no more than a kind of Tai Chi argumentation, a way to evade the substance of any issue. Many believe it only makes matters more ambiguous and convoluted. In reality, dialectics is wholly incompatible with binary, oversimplified thinking, the kind that insists everything must be either right or wrong, black or white. Let us consider three familiar images often used to illustrate dialectics. Which one do you think is correct? In fact, all three are forms of dialectics, but distorted versions, not true dialectic. In the previous section, we criticized these modes of thought because they represent three common and harmful misunderstandings of dialectical reasoning. Now let's revisit each of these types to understand where the stereotype, dialectics only muddles right and wrong, actually comes from. The first type is known as the compromise dialectics, or the everyone wins dialectics. This form of thought attempts an unprincipled reconciliation, blending seemingly opposing elements into an artificial synthesis. In colloquial terms, it's akin to watering things down to make them easier to swallow, or using both the carrot and the stick. Its defining feature is the mixing of different, sometimes entirely unrelated elements, forced together by vague assertions. For example, saying, "The moon in the sky and the bun in your hand are alike because they're both round," is purely mechanical reasoning. A more familiar example might be, "Scolding children might make them behave better, but it harms their psyche. Therefore, we need to take a dialectical approach." Here, people simply place two propositions side by side and conclude that we must take a multifaceted perspective, without ever analyzing the actual contradiction between the two elements, their internal dynamics, or how the contradiction might be fundamentally resolved. This approach completely ignores the core principle of dialectics, that contradiction is the driving force of development in things, and that contradiction is internal, not something artificially imposed from outside. Blending everything into a seemingly neutral mixture is nothing more than mechanical aggregation. It doesn't help us understand the essence of things. The second type is called pseudo-triadic dialectics, a misinterpretation of Hegel's model of thesis, antithesis, synthesis. In this model, people often reason like this: humans are alive, thesis; humans will die, antithesis; so the synthesis is that humans go through birth, aging, illness, death. This seems logical, but is fundamentally flawed. It treats thesis and antithesis as separate concepts and mechanically adds them together to form a conclusion. This method completely overlooks the internal dynamics of contradiction and the law of dialectical negation. In genuine dialectics, the antithesis does not come from outside. It is the internal self-negation of the thesis itself. Death is not merely an event that follows life, but its opposite, something already inherent in life. Life and death coexist as a dialectical unity, and it is the presence of death that gives life its meaning, motion, and development. Synthesis is not simply an addition, it is the result of a transformative negation, where positive elements of both sides are preserved and elevated to a new level. The third type, considered the most sophisticated of all, is the artificial form of dialectics of unified contradictions. This version is dangerous because it disguises itself with a veneer of philosophical depth, while in reality offering only vague reconciliation between opposing elements. It often appears in lofty, moral-sounding statements such as, "There's always good in the bad," "Right and wrong are just perspectives," or "Black and white coexist." While these arguments may seem open-minded and objective, they actually obscure the nature of contradiction, blur the boundaries between opposing forces, and evade any attempt at resolving real conflict. Rather than revealing the dynamic force behind the development of things, they render everything static, frozen, and immutable. Ultimately, all three forms of vulgar dialectics share a common flaw. They fail to analyze, identify, or apply contradiction as a driving force of development. They either lump everything together indiscriminately, reduce negation to a mechanical formula, or conceal contradiction beneath artificial harmony. In contrast, genuine dialectics is not a tool for evasion or forced equilibrium. It is a method for exposing the dynamic essence of contradiction, recognizing the process of transformation and evolution through dialectical negation. The formula representing this third type of dialectics might be expressed as A equals AA or AA. Even from such a schema, one can sense the underlying mentality that nothing remains what it is. The core of this form of dialectical thinking lies in its attempt to emphasize contradiction as the primary principle of all things, reducing every phenomenon to a generalized format of contradictory relationships. This dialectical form is marked by a tendency toward extremism. It tries to subsume every object and phenomenon into a vast network of opposition contradiction. Unlike the compromise dialectics, which seeks to avoid contradiction through blending, here, everything is pulled into the machinery of contradiction, whether it genuinely belongs there or not. It exaggerates the notion of contradiction to an extreme, constructing an overarching web that supposedly encompasses the entire world. For example, it may legitimize absurd conclusions such as, day and night are contradictions, men and women are contradictions, or even claim through convoluted reasoning that a man is no longer a man, a woman is no longer a woman. Merely because of gender identity changes, it uses empirical examples, such as transgender individuals, to argue that every phenomenon is an expression of contradiction, thereby rationalizing conclusions riddled with sophistry. This way of thinking leads many to equate dialectics with sophism, stripping away its scientific and revolutionary essence. So what is the triviality of this type of dialectics? The problem lies in how this unified contradiction model treats contradiction as a universal key capable of unlocking every mystery, explaining every phenomenon. This is a grave mistake. While proper dialectical reasoning uses contradiction as a starting point to delve deeper into the intrinsic motion of things, this kind of thinking elevates contradiction to an absolute endpoint. True dialectics does not assign moral value to contradiction. It is neither good nor bad. It is simply the inherent dynamic within all things. Contradiction is the energy that propels transformation and development. But when it is exaggerated to the point of being everywhere, it loses its specificity, its historical context, and the conditions of its formation. At that point, distinctions between phenomena, levels, and time periods are erased. Everything is dragged into an abstract theoretical game, like falling into a pitch-black abyss where logic can no longer offer any orientation. At the core of this trivialized form of dialectics lies the ambition to construct a world interconnected by an endless web of contradictions. But such an approach is overly abstract, simplifies history, and strips contradictions of their specificity, conditions, and stages within real-life contexts. Every contradiction has its own background, internal dynamics, modes of expression, and direction of transformation. One cannot impose a single formula upon all of them. Therefore, if one only emphasizes that contradiction is universal, then one has already neglected the most important task of dialectics: to uncover the development and transformation within each phenomenon, rather than reducing all things to versions of one another. In reality, exaggerating the concept of contradiction paralyzes concrete understanding, making people unable to perceive the essential differences between phenomena, leaving only a tangled mess with no way out. Worse still, this use of dialectics is often accompanied by politicization or the abuse of power, turning the concept of contradiction into a tool for explaining everything, persuading everyone, and imposing a singular worldview. In such cases, dialectics is no longer a scientific method for uncovering reality, but rather a rhetorical device, seemingly profound on the surface, but actually empty and demagogic. These are the three most common forms of vulgar dialectics today. Though in reality there are other variations, these three represent the majority of misunderstandings and abuses of dialectical thinking. Now that we've peeled off those masks, we can finally approach the core question: what is true dialectics? It is no exaggeration to say, if you ask me what the greatest essence of Western philosophy is, I would not hesitate to answer: dialectics. When you first study philosophy, mastering the metaphysical spirit determines whether you are studying it properly. But how far you can go, whether you can truly dive deep into Western thought, depends on whether you genuinely understand dialectics. The entire history of Western philosophy, from ancient times to the modern era, revolves either around constructing dialectical systems or deconstructing dialectics to discover new approaches. No great philosopher can avoid confronting dialectics, not even those from the analytic school, traditionally seen as opposing the continental tradition. Only dialectics can truly confront the most profound metaphysical problems. Only when you approach the world dialectically can you face the existential void left by metaphysics. Only dialectics can connect subject and object and seek resolutions to the seemingly irreconcilable contradictions of traditional philosophy. From the perspective of epistemology, dialectics is the self-enclosed mechanism of reason itself, helping us answer the question, how is the cognition of the world even possible? And if we want to fully understand the scope of dialectics, we cannot overlook Hegel. I mentioned earlier, we must not impose dialectics into some ready-made conceptual framework or rigid classification. Doing so only distorts our understanding. In the actual history of thought, dialectical forms are interwoven and develop through overlapping layers. There are no clear dividing lines. The only way to properly understand dialectics is to follow the historical trajectory of thought and arrive at the moment where dialectics reached its highest development. That moment is Hegel. Hegel was the first and remains the only thinker to bring dialectics to full completion. He not only synthesized the entirety of Western thought before him, but also restructured philosophical reasoning itself, making dialectics the core methodology with which he built one of the most comprehensive philosophical systems in history. Hegel's dialectic is not a formula like thesis plus antithesis equals synthesis. It is not merely about opposition and reconciliation. Rather, it is a dynamic process in which all things, all entities carry within themselves the impetus for self-negation, self-development, and the drive toward a new form of completeness. In Hegel's world, contradiction is not a tumor, not a mistake to be eliminated, nor something that needs to be specially named. Contradiction is a natural part of all things, so evident that it requires no emphasis. Only when we learn to think dialectically can we see that contradiction is what sets the world in motion, keeps it operating, and drives its ceaseless development. It is precisely because contradiction exists that we must dissect each phenomenon to expose the opposing elements within it. From a dialectical perspective, contradiction is the fundamental force driving a thing's development, the inner engine of motion in every existence. And it is through deconstructing and unveiling these contradictions that we can return to critique the pseudo-triadic dialectic model. The pseudo-triadic model of dialectics claims that the thesis must be combined with the antithesis in order to create a new existence, that only by separating the two opposing sides and then merging them can something new be constructed. But this interpretation is simplistic and mistaken. In authentic dialectical reasoning, there is no need to mechanically separate thesis, antithesis, and synthesis in such a rigid way, because every phenomenon already contains internal contradictions, and the antithesis is embedded within the thesis as its own negation. The synthesis is nothing more than the thesis itself after undergoing a process of self-negation and transformation. Put simply, thesis, antithesis, synthesis is not a formula into which we can force every phenomenon like a mathematical equation. Rather, it is a method of analysis that momentarily freezes the inherent motion of a thing so we can peer into its internal structure and logic of operation. According to Hegel, any phenomenon enters into movement the moment its state of stasis is disrupted. It is the negation of that static state that reveals the contradiction. And it is precisely through the generation and development of this contradiction that a thing can transition from its current state to a future one, from simplicity to complexity, from lower to higher. For Hegel, no existence or concept is fixed or immutable. Each contains internal tensions, opposing aspects within itself. This principle not only drives each entity to move and evolve, but also enables interaction between different entities, each carrying its own contradiction, thereby opening up a multitude of possibilities and diverse actualizations. A clear example is the concept of being. In Western philosophy, being is a foundational and universal category, But when examined through the lens of dialectics, we find that within being always lies the element of non-being as an external difference, constitutive of it. It is precisely this metaphysical obsession with asking what makes being possible that reveals the fatal weakness of traditional metaphysics. In contrast, dialectics operates by constantly examining the tension between a thing's internal and external dimensions. In the dialectical view, every existent comes with a constitutive outside, that which makes its being possible. In other words, being cannot exist without non-being as its opposing foundation that defines it. This is the profound insight of Hegel's dialectics, where categories are not static but constantly move, continually surpassing themselves. Since every concept is dynamic, no concept can be forever confined within its original definitional boundary. A concept inherently contains its own opposite, and under the pressure of internal contradiction, it moves toward that opposite. It negates itself. But this negation is not a termination. It is a self-negating process of development, one that overcomes its old limits while preserving the original creative energy, ultimately transforming itself at a higher level. It is important to note that this process is not a closed circle or monotonous cycle, but a spiraling upward movement. Each cycle is a release of a higher potential for understanding, expanding the depth of human cognition. This is the principle of spiral dialectical development, a core element of Hegel's thought. This mode of operation applies not only to ontology but also clearly manifests in epistemology. Knowledge is no longer a static collection of eternal truths, but a process of continual refinement. When knowledge first emerges, it often reflects only a partial or rudimentary aspect. But as the subject discovers the internal contradictions, the system of knowledge adjusts and evolves toward a more comprehensive form. Take history as an example. Every social formation, every ideology, every institution is the product of specific historical conditions and contains its own internal contradictions. These contradictions drive history forward. An ancient democratic system, though progressive in its time, contains limitations that eventually render it obsolete. Once contradictions reach a critical point, that system is negated and replaced by a new form of democracy, more suitable for modern conditions. Hegel emphasized, development does not follow a straight line, but a spiral. Each new stage does not merely negate the previous one, but also inherits and elevates part of what came before. For instance, in modern society, the emphasis on individual rights both negates the collectivist mindset of the medieval era and continues to develop the notion of individuality, first celebrated in ancient Greek culture. Dialectics is not only a tool for analyzing history, but also a method for distinguishing between appearance and essence. Often we are seduced by surface manifestations and mistake them for the whole of reality. Yet it is dialectics that teaches us, to grasp the essence, we must look deeply into the internal oppositions within a thing. For example, freedom may seem like the ability to do whatever one wishes, but in truth, freedom can only exist when we recognize and accept necessary limitations. This is the dialectical relationship between freedom and necessity. Methodologically, dialectics requires us to see the world dynamically, to perceive the interconnections among things, and to grasp the laws of internal transformation. It stands against fragmented, static, one-dimensional thinking. It urges us to view phenomena as part of an integrated whole, in the process of movement, and in relation to other things. This is especially crucial when analyzing social phenomena, which are the result of countless complex interactions. Hegel emphasized an important principle: the negation of the negation. The first negation breaks apart the old state and introduces a general opposition. The second negation synthesizes at a higher level, retaining what is rational and dynamic, while discarding what is outdated. This is not a circular repetition, but a transformation in quality, an ascent in depth. In the process of cognition, identifying internal oppositions is the condition for attaining a more comprehensive understanding. And that comprehensiveness is never final, it always opens up new possibilities. To understand an issue is not to go from A to Z once, but to cycle repeatedly through affirmation, negation, higher affirmation. Dialectics is not only a method of thinking, it is also a compass for action. It teaches us that reform does not mean erasing the past, but rather selectively overcoming it, renewing on the basis of what has come before, preserving the rational, discarding the obsolete. In practice, it helps us identify the principal contradiction, locate the critical knot of the problem, the point at which development can be unlocked. Of course, Hegel's entire theory cannot be compressed into just a few thousand words. This summary deliberately omits many crucial aspects, such as the master-slave dialectic or the concept of absolute spirit. The reason is that this piece is not intended as a deep academic inquiry, but rather to offer you an intuitive understanding of what true dialectics is. In the following sections, we will explore Marx's dialectics and conclude this introductory journey by comparing what Hegel left behind with how Marx inherited and transcended him.